Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on 17th of August. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor and your host for this week. Coming up on the show, Trump's being indicted again. You'll be forgiven for losing track of the lawsuits stacking up against the former president. But we have Andrew Neil on the show today to break these down and the implications for Trump's chances of re-election. Back in the UK, today is results day for hundreds of thousands of young people. This is the year that we are supposedly back to pre-pandemic normalcy, but is the COVID impact on young people really over? I speak to the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan. We'll also be joined by Spectator contributors Toby Young and Rachel Johnson, and I'll be asking them the same question posed by the Spectator's cover article this week. Is university still worth it? Also on the show, I'll be speaking to author William Cook about why some Brits are falling out of love with Germany. In the face of a hardline right-wing party on the rise and an economy seeming to slow down, was Germany ever the modern aspirational state some liberal Brits seem to think it was? And finally, from Germany to the world, the author and cook Anya von Bremzen joins me on the show to discuss her upcoming book, which is all about food and the role it plays in one's national identity. She also busts some of favourite myths about the origins of traditional foods. And do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Spectator TV is picking up thousands of new subscribers every week, and you should be one of them. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. First up, Trump's been indicted again. Before this year, no sitting or former president had ever been indicted, and this isn't even Donald Trump's first legal troubles. But will any of it really impact his chances of re-election? I'm joined by Andrew Neil. Andrew, welcome back to Spectator TV. It's great to have you.
Good to be back.
Andrew, I had a moment of deja vu earlier this week when I saw the headline, Trump indicted, come back up again. So for viewers who've lost track, like me, who've lost track of the amount of legal cases against Donald Trump, can you just update us on what this latest one is about?
Right, he says, quickly looking at his notes. Well, he is now indicted on 91 accounts. I'll say that again, 91 counts he's been indicted in four broad indictments. The original one, at least the first in chronological order, was to do with the hush money that he paid a porn star. Or is alleged to have paid them. Well, he paid the money, they're calling it hush money. I must say now, that seems small beer compared to what has come since. And then we've had Special Prosecutor Smith bring two counts against him. One is Mr. Trump's handling of the classified documents, particularly at Mar-a-Lago, and the efforts he made really not to hand them back, which is doing him more damage than the act of taking them in the first place. Then, of course, there's the third, broader one about his behaviour in the run-up to January the 6th and post what he regarded as the stolen election. And, of course, the riot that broke out in Capitol Hill that day and his role in that. And then, of course, this latest one. Now, these first three, the Smith ones are federal. This one in Georgia this week is state. It's not federal, but this is to do with the specific efforts he took to try and get those responsible for the count in Georgia to do as he wanted. He lost Georgia by fewer than 12,000 votes. There's a famous tape call when he speaks to the Republican local official there, local politician, the Secretary of State, I believe he was at the time, for Georgia, saying you just need to find me 11,000 and several hundred votes and I'll be fine. So that is all that, plus fake electors leaning on people to change their mind, do different things. This one is interesting. I always thought the Georgia one might be the most important of all, because that tape alone is pretty hard to explain. He's clearly urging the local official to find 12,000 votes somewhere.
I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state. You should want to have an accurate election, and you're a Republican.
We believe that we do have an accurate election.
No, I know you don't. No, you don't. You don't have, not even close.
But also, because this is a state rap he's up against, if he loses, he cannot pardon himself if he becomes president again. Presidents can't do that. They can pardon themselves, at least we think they can, for a federal rap. They can't pardon themselves for a state rap. What he's been accused of, which is under the RICO laws, which are the racketeering laws, which go back to 1970, and this is a Georgia version of the federal racketeering laws, which basically killed the Italian mafia in the United States, basically destroyed the Italian mafia. They're using that against them as they've broadened it out as well. That carries a minimum of a 5-year sentence. So there's no plea bargaining there. There's no probation. It's a minimum 5-year sentence to do that. And even the governor of Georgia cannot pardon him. So even a friendly Republican couldn't pardon him. So in many ways, that's the more dangerous one. But you add them all up, the 91 indictments in 4 separate cases, which means that how much time he'll spend on the campaign trail and how much time he'll spend in the courtroom is a moot point. I mean, there just aren't enough hours in the day to do both.
Yes, so he'll be going to trial for these cases next year. But in the longer term, we might have a president of America, or former president, or president if he wins again, being in jail. Could that happen?
Yes, it could happen. I mean, he could run for president in jail. It's happened before.
Did he run the country from jail?
Well, yeah, it has happened before. There was an American socialist called Eugene Debs. He's what today we'd call a peacenik. He was against the draft, the conscription in World War I. President Wilson basically had him arrested during the war, towards the end of the war, and he was stuck in a federal penitentiary. Interestingly, he was tried under the then new Espionage Act, which covers more than espionage, and one of Special Prosecutor Smith's cases against him is under that against Mr. Trump is under that 1917 espionage too. Wow. So the same piece of legislation affected Eugene Debs. It put him in the slammer and is now being used against Mr. Trump. Now, that was in the run-up to the 1920 election, where Woodrow Wilson didn't run again. He'd had a stroke. His wife had been running the country. So the Republican candidate was Warren Harding. Eugene Debs ran from jail, from a federal penitentiary, and he got about 1 million votes, which was a little better than one of the previous elections when he had run. So you could do it. I think maybe a little harder today, because he didn't win either. Harding won by pretty much a landslide. But you could see some of it being run, I think, from jail. Though I don't think the trials are going to happen quick enough for that to happen. The Special Prosecutor Smith has said he wants one of his cases to begin on January the 2nd, which would be 2 weeks before the Iowa caucus, which is the kickoff of the Republican primary season. Good luck with that. The woman who's reading the case against Mr. Trump in Georgia, she says she wants it within 6 months for hers to begin. Well, she's taken 2.5 years to get here. The 98-page document she's produced doesn't really tell us anything we didn't know about the behavior of Mr. Trump and his acolytes already. And she has indicted 18 other co-conspirators, including Rudy Giuliani and that somewhat mad woman, Sidney Powell, the one that said the Kraken wakes. I mean, if anybody has ever a sandwich short of a picnic, it's her. And of course, Mr. Meadows, who was his chief of staff. There is no way all of that is going to be done in 6 months' time, ready to go to trial. So I suspect more likely some of them, I think we'll probably go through the Iowa caucus and then the New Hampshire primary, which is a couple of weeks later to the end of January. I think they will both happen without any of the trials happening, Cindy. I think there will be some pre-trial hearings. There'll be some motions before the court. Lawyers will see this is a dripping roast. They'll have their snouts in the trough to get as big a fees as they can from everybody involved. but I don't think any trial is going to begin. It may have begun by Super Tuesday, which is in March, but probably not before then.
But Andrew, what does all of this mean for Trump's campaign and its possibility of success? Because on the one hand, as you say, there's literally not enough hours, and I think they're spending a lot of campaign finance on the lawyers as well. Yeah. On the other hand, it seems like if you believe that this is a political witch hunt against Trump, you're simply going to believe it even more with every single method of lawfare, as some have called it, that comes up. So what do you think?
Well, you're right. A big chunk of the campaign finance that Mr. Trump has been raising is going on legal fees. And I suspect that percentage will rise as we get towards the trials. And the lawyers then spend, I mean, you really start to rack up legal fees when you get into court or in the lead up to court. That's when the real money is, when these lawyers all bill by the hour. And I think we're in the wrong business. I think we should quickly get a legal education and start billing by the hour. So it's going to be hugely expensive. Now, what it's done so far is consolidated his base. I mean, he did joke a couple of weeks ago, I just need one more indictment and I'll be unbeatable in the race of the Republican nomination. Well, he's got his indictment and he does look unbeatable, I must say. He does look unbeatable for the Republican nomination. All these indictments seem just to reinforce the base that what he calls the deep state is out to get him. And he says, they're coming for me now, but if we don't win this, they're coming for you, he says to his base. And they lap it up. And it's been a disaster for the other candidates. The DeSantis campaign, governor of Florida, thought to be the only real challenger to Mr. Trump. His campaign is a mess now, going nowhere. He's fired some people. He's having to reboot it. It also, Cindy, puts them in the people who would challenge Trump, it puts them in a really difficult situation because it means people like you and me ask them questions such as, well, was the election stolen? Is it right that Mr. Trump should face all these indictments? Did he do anything wrong? Does he deserve to be tried under the racketeering laws for a criminal conspiracy? And they're terrified of these questions because they're terrified of saying anything that will annoy the Trump base. So as things stand at the moment, he is the Republican candidate. That's just the way it is now. The unforeseen things can happen, which by definition we don't know. But at the moment, he is the Republican candidate. Now, the conventional wisdom is yes, all this gets him the Republican nomination again, but it is putting off suburban voters. It is particularly putting off middle-class suburban women, who he got in 2016 and lost in 2020. And none of this is doing him any favors come the general election. That's the conventional wisdom. I think there's a lot to it. I would simply put two markers on the ground just to keep an eye on Cindy. So far, and in a way I share that conventional wisdom too, the famous soccer moms, as they call them in America, are not going to like what Trump has been up to with the fake election, or January the 6th, or whatever. But there's no sign yet in the polls that this is playing to Mr. Biden's advantage. Because you would think, all right, it's getting the Republican nomination, but Biden's lead in a notional poll, Trump versus Biden, of which there is a lot of polling being done on that now, surely Biden will be moving further and further ahead. There is no sign of that in the polls, Cindy. All the signs are is that they're nip and tuck. They're around 44%. They're both within the margin of error. It is too close to call in these polls at the moment. So that's something to keep an eye on and kind of, in a way, makes you question the conventional wisdom. Second thing I would look for is, I'm still not in any doubt he will lose a lot of middle-class suburban votes. He is doing nothing. He's consolidating his base, but he's doing nothing to win back the people that voted for him in 2016, but he lost in 2020. That's not happening. However, there are signs that an increasing number of working class Hispanic voters are moving his way, are moving the Republican way, and therefore moving his way too. And although there aren't as many of them around as there are white suburban middle class women, some of what he's not getting back could be made up for. And remember, if you take by these Hispanic voters who are becoming more and more Republican over the years, you know, the House recently elected its first ever Mexican-born congressman, actually a woman, and a Republican from a district that borders Texas with Mexico. So that is going on as we speak. And that could make a difference, that could help counteract the fact that he's not getting that moderate white suburban vote back again.
Fascinating. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on to Spectator TV.
Pleasure. Good to see you again, Cindy.
Now back home, hundreds of thousands of 18-year-olds are receiving their results day today on A-levels and other qualifications. 3 years from the beginning of the pandemic, there are hopes that a return to 2019 grade levels marks the beginning of recovery in young people's lives. But is it really so easy? I'm delighted to be joined by the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan. Gillian Keegan, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV.
Thank you for having me, Cindy.
Now, compared to the turbulence of the last few years on Results Day, today's results seem to be back to 2019 levels. Is this a good thing? I mean, the government must be breathing a sigh of relief.
Yes, well, that was the policy intention. That's what we decided we wanted to do. And we announced it 2 years ago. But of course, there's lots and lots of moving pieces that are involved in making sure that that can happen. So yeah, we're delighted that we're back to 2019 results. And more importantly, that lots of young people have got their firm or their insurance offer, so they'll be off to their destination. So 91% of them, which is fantastic news for them.
Yes, absolutely. And that percentage is roughly the same as 2019 as well. So that is good to see. But was there some level of massaging that needed to be done by exam boards, in the sense that, you know, many of these students, it's probably the first time they've ever done an exam like this because of the disruption to their school lives. They haven't really had the same practice as previous years had. So for them, it is still a pretty tough year, isn't it? It's still an unlucky year.
Well, I mean, they've done brilliantly, and they've really shown the resilience in a way and their hard work, and it's paid off. But yes, they haven't had GCSEs, but I've just been talking to a bunch of students, and they said that it's actually the schools that have done a lot of work, and the head teachers, to prepare them, even though they didn't have exams, to prepare them for these really major exams. Everyone remembers if they did A-levels, their A-levels. So they're really rather, sort of crucial exams. And they've done lots of prep, lots of mocks, lots of, conditions so that they can really get used to the environment, even though they did miss it at GCSE. And actually, a couple of the students here were saying that actually they were glad they did that, because if not, they'd be going off to university still thinking, I've still got my first exams to come, and they'd be a little bit more on their own there. Right. So I think it's actually been quite good for them to actually, make sure that they get themselves ready, because you can't really go through your whole of your student life without some kind of exam.
Yes, a bit of a baptism by fire, I guess. Do you worry about a socioeconomic split that, you talk about the preparation that some schools have given to students? It is clear that some state schools are not able to give that kind of resource to their students. And we've seen that in the absentee numbers as well, where many students just haven't really come back to school. And private schools, on the other hand, do better. Do you worry about that socioeconomic split?
Well, we always worry about, making sure that disadvantaged pupils get the most opportunities. I mean, that's been something we've been focused on since 2010. It's why we've introduced free schools and multi-academy trusts. It's why we focused on school standards, on curriculum, focused on giving, getting that, equality gap down. And we were doing a brilliant job, actually, up until 2019. From 2010 to 2019, we closed that gap by 9.1%. But clearly the pandemic has knocked us back a bit. So we do have to now continue to focus on that. And you're right, you mentioned absenteeism. That is something that is particularly concerning, particularly those groups of students who are now pretty much out of the classroom or persistently absent from the classroom. So there's been a huge focus on attendance and trying to make sure that for September, when kids go back at school, that we get those children back in school, because we know if they start the first week in September, they're much more likely to stay. So there's been a lot of activity over the summer with local authorities and with academy trusts to make sure that we do that. But I think a lot of our state schools and a lot of our academies, I mean, I'm actually at an academy right now, and they were the pupils telling me about all that prep. So I think most of them have prepared their students well for these exams, knowing that they didn't sit down and take GCSEs in the normal way.
Now, Gillian, the Spectator's cover article this week is asking the question of whether or not university is worth it. And the author, Ross Clark, basically takes a look at all the different ways in which university life these days is quite difficult, really. You've got striking lecturers, you've got student accommodations really under pressure and very, very expensive. You've got student loans by the end of it with no guarantee of a good job by the end of it. And also things like Zoom teaching not going away. So the question is, do university students have too little power to demand better service from the universities that are meant to be providing them the service for quite expensive fees? The last few years obviously were exceptional circumstances, but even now it seems like some of these COVID impacts are still long-lasting.
Well, as you say, there have been exceptional circumstances, and that's the great thing about really focusing on getting back to normal, which has been a big part of what we've been trying to do with A-levels as well this year. And I'm sure universities will be taking exactly the same approach as well. Everybody wants to get back to normal. But I think if I was writing the cover, I'd say make sure university is worth it. So make sure that you think clearly about what you want to do, what you want to get out of university, which university you want to go to, what accommodations available. In terms of student power, students actually have probably more power than they ever have over the years, because we do have the Office for Students. They can make complaints to their university, but they can also go to the Office for Students, to the adjudicator there, if they feel that they have been unfairly treated. And, you know, they are a consumer now in this process. You know, they pay and invest £9,250 for their tuition. Now, clearly, nobody wants to see, the strikes that are happening in some universities where some lecturers are withdrawing that service. That is outrageous, and they shouldn't be doing that. And we've written to them and urged them to resolve that dispute, and they shouldn't be doing that. That's really the wrong thing to do. However, I think making sure there's many options that you have. Young people now have more options than they've ever had. So I was very lucky. I did a degree apprenticeship years and years ago, but not many people have heard about degree apprenticeships. But now we have 140 different occupations that you can access via a degree apprenticeship. So if you want to be a lawyer, an accountant, a medical doctor, a space engineer, a nurse, a policeman, pretty much any sort of career you can think of, you can now access that via a high-level apprenticeship or a degree apprenticeship. So those are offers that are there that were probably not there in any great numbers for students a few years ago. So we're really focused on making sure that there's a broad range of offers, and that's been part of the Conservative government's focus on technical education as well, building up high technical qualifications, introducing T-levels, introducing new institutes of technology. And we've worked with 5,000 businesses to basically make sure that we have the right technical education in place so that there are broader opportunities and not everybody has to go just down one path.
Yes, and Gillian, but that's quite an intractable problem, isn't it? Because it comes down to the prestige of degrees. You know, students and families think that that's what they need to have. How do you change people's minds like that? You've got your policies, you've got these opportunities, but how do you change people's minds when it's about status symbol?
Well, that was the challenge I had when I was the Apprenticeships and Skills Minister, and I used to think long and hard how I could do that, and I thought the best way to do that was to change the perception of degree apprenticeships, which is why I said we need a medical doctor one, we need a lawyer one, and we need an accountant's one, because those three professions are professions that everybody understands, and the reason you're going to university to do these degrees is to access those kind of professions. So we've worked with companies like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and KPMG and PwC, all those aspirational careers that people want for their young people, and we've made sure they are part of designing the apprenticeship system and making sure that they have two offers that are available: people who want to go to university and then go on a graduate route, and people who want to go straight from A-levels and do a degree apprenticeship or a higher level apprenticeship. So they've been the people who've really helped us, and I think now more and more people are getting aware of that, because really a lot of people, when they're looking at university, they look at it for lots of different reasons, but For sure, one is to access a great career like being a medical doctor or being a lawyer or accountant. They're very aspirational careers. So I've made sure that we fitted the aspirational careers into that system so that everybody can understand that this is just a different route to the same destination.
Gillian Keegan, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
Thank you, Cindy.
And following on from that, the million-dollar question, is university really worth going to? What with online teaching remaining, costly accommodation and lecturers on strike, today's students seem to have a poorer deal than they've had in years. I'm joined by Toby Young and Rachel Johnson. Toby and Rachel, thank you so much for joining me on Spectator TV.
Our pleasure.
Now, you both have read our cover article from the magazine this week talking about all the ways in which universities are just really, I think, shortchanging students these days. Would you agree? I mean, Toby, you can start.
Well, I think it depends what subject you do, Cindy. There was a survey done by Bristol University which found that at Durham, if you were doing physics, you got 3 times as many teaching hours as you did if you were doing history. I think that generally applies across the university sector. If you're not doing a natural science or mathematics, then you're going to get less teaching time and less bang for your buck. But I don't think that applies as much to Oxford and Cambridge. So because they have the tutorial system and you get these kind of one-on-one face-to-face tutorials every week, even if you're doing a humanities or a social science subject, I think the discrepancy is slightly less pronounced at Oxford and Cambridge. But in the rest of the sector, if you're doing something other than a hard science or mathematics, I think you are being shortchanged.
And a lot of this contact hours, Rachel, is now virtual, right? Because after the pandemic, a lot of lecture halls and professors haven't gone back to in-person teaching. They've insisted on virtual teaching.
I know, and I think that's absolutely scandalous. And I can understand why Prime Minister talks about rip-off courses. I mean, this cohort is being called, I think, the unluckiest cohort ever. And, they didn't do GCSEs. They had their A-level grades assigned in the last 2 years by their teachers, but this is the first year they're being marked. So we're seeing, the Prime Minister should hail this, a great reduction in grade inflation, but this is adding into the problems of this particular cohort. I think that hybrid teaching, there is absolutely no excuse for it. I think up to a third of courses are still being taught partly online. Why? Why aren't the students showing a bit of the spirit of 68? Why aren't the 68 of the younger generation taking to the streets and saying, we don't want to, we want degrees, not 40 years of debt, which is what actually university seems to be offering at the moment.
With exorbitant interest rates, I look at my paycheck every month and I look at how much it goes away onto student loans.
Isn't it about 7% now?
Yes, and some people have no chance of paying it back. And Toby, what about the power of students then? Rachel talks about students taking things into their own hands, but it does feel like, students are paying this money to go to university. They're consumers of a sort, but they don't have much power in demanding the kind of courses that they want, the kind of teaching that they want. Is there power imbalance here?
I think there is a power imbalance, and I think it's because there are too few universities. I think there are about 175 now in the UK. That's probably less than in the state of Texas. And that's one of the reasons universities can still charge relatively high tuition fees and neglect their students when they get there because there just isn't enough competition. The creation of the Office for Students 3 years ago was supposed to make it easier for new entrants to become universities into the marketplace, but it hasn't really happened. Maybe it'll start to happen, but I think what we need to see in order to give students a better deal is much more competition and at least some new universities saying, okay, you're going to do most of your courses online, but it'll only take you 2 years and it'll cost you half the price. When that starts to happen, then the rest of the sector may begin to get its act together.
We have had a couple of new entrants, Cindy, haven't we? We've had Buckingham and the University of the Humanities, the one that Anthony Grayling
London,
and
yes.
Anthony Seld, no, is he AC Grayling and Anthony Seld started? But presumably they have more latitude to charge higher fees than Oxford and Cambridge. And of course, as Toby was pointing out, Oxford and Cambridge are still hugely good value because half their intake comes from private schools where parents have been paying 50 grand, we now read, per annum to educate their children there. So at £9,000 a year at Oxbridge, that is a snip. That is chump change to these parents who are, if they are stumping for their students, isn't it? And also you get much bigger bang for your buck at Oxbridge because of the tutorial system. And also you do get housed. I mean, that's the other issue for this year. I read something like a third of students aren't even being offered accommodation in the university, and if not the university, not even in the town. I mean, Bristol is busing kids to a campus an hour away and housing them in a kind of Bibby Stockholm situation. I mean, what is happening? If Toby's right, it's about, there's too much too much demand and not enough supply. Well, if that's the case, why aren't people piling into the university sector? Why aren't Toby and I starting the university, our own university, Tobes?
That's an idea.
Yeah, I did think about that, Rachel. One of the reasons I applied to become a non-executive director at the Office for Students back in 2018, when your brother Joe effectively set it up, was I wanted to gain some coalface experience so I could then set up a university, set up a new competitor. Unfortunately, I only held the job for about 8 days because I got cancelled. Yeah, I mean, I'm up for that. I've helped set up 4 schools. My father started the Open University, which is still, I think, the largest university in Europe if you judge it by the number of students. So if he can do it, why can't we?
But hold on, before you guys get...
I've got a title for it. Everyone wants to go to Oxbridge. We should locate it in Uxbridge, and we should start the University of Uxbridge. And people will think they're getting an Oxbridge degree. They'll just think it's a bit of a typo.
Yeah,
maybe you could get a former MP there to be the Chancellor.
I think there may well already be a University of Uxbridge. One point I wanted to make is about housing, Cindy, is that one of the most scandalous things about the extraordinary restrictions imposed on university students during the pandemic is that even though all their learning for more than a year was remote, and they weren't allowed to leave their halls of residence. So, for most of them, they'd be far better off going home rather than being cooped up in these dorms and kind of stuck on their computers all day. But the universities locked them into these housing contracts, said, sorry, you can go home if you want, but you're still going to have to pay full rent for 12 months. That was absolutely scandalous. And to Rachel's point about, where are the rebels? There is a class action suit percolating away by students against universities for having ruined 3 years of their lives during the pandemic. And it looks like that'll come to a head next year. But it's not all bad news from the Free Speech Union's point of view. The organisation I set up 3 years ago, one of our largest donors was the largest donor to Durham, but he was so disenchanted by Durham's draconian COVID restrictions, making life miserable for students at Durham, that he's now giving the money he would otherwise give to Durham to the Free Speech Union.
Wow. So there's the beginning of a university already. But Toby and Rachel, I am surprised to hear you both say that the problem is not enough universities. Haven't we been talking about in the last few years degree inflation? The government talks about these Mickey Mouse degrees. Isn't the problem that students who might be better off doing apprenticeships or just getting a job are being shoved into university courses that don't really teach them anything, and they still are saddled with the same amount of debt as an Oxbridge student? Rachel?
Well, I think that students should be encouraged to do non-academic disciplines as much as they can. Looking back on it, I don't know why I read Greats at Oxford. It was a completely unsuitable degree. I was probably completely unsuitable for it. There were huge upsides. It was just at a time where everybody presumed you would go to, top university, a Russell Group one, and read something, disciplined, that qualified as a proper university subject. But now we've seen the evidence, and Ross Clark's piece really sets this out, that their graduate degrees do not translate into graduate jobs. And a lot of graduates are like working bars, doing low-paid, low-skilled jobs, for which they're vastly overqualified. Now, I don't know what the answer to that is, and it just strikes me that there should be some sort of transfer system whereby, the young people who are able and fit should maybe not go to university as soon as they do. I've got a a young nephew who's just 18. And if I feel I was immature when I went, I mean, I think a lot of people do feel they're not ready to go. And yet we've got 2.5 million of economically inactive people who are being paid to do nothing, rather than these young also economically inactive people who are paying to learn skills. It seems to me that there's a problem there. And if you're a really creative chancellor, you would maybe pay the economically inactive 50-year-olds who are sitting on their asses since the pandemic to reskill in some way, to use these, take up one of these 29,000 courses. Meanwhile, you should actually enable the really young kids who maybe are going to university, far from even where the university is based, not really ready because of the 3-year pandemic. Pay them to do something else for a bit. And then when they've learned a bit more about themselves and the world and what they want to do with their lives, then they go to university. I just think everything's the wrong way round at the moment, but that's a really separate issue.
It's a really interesting idea. Toby and Rachel, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much for coming on to Spectator TV.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Bye, Toby.
Bye, Rachel.
Next, are some Brits falling out of love with Germany? With a rising hardline right-wing party and a slowing economy, it seems like Germany has just as many challenges as any other country. In this week's magazine, William Cook asks whether some Brits haven't been oversimplifying in the country. He joins me now. So, William Cook, thank you so much for coming on to Spectator TV. You write in your piece that liberal Britain has fallen out of love with Germany rather rapidly recently. First of all, can we talk about what's happened in Germany to make people reconsider their rather rosy views of the country?
Certainly. Well, I mean, 3 things have happened, really. One is that Merkel's left, and this kind of talisman of the kind of liberal left in Britain kind of exited the stage. So maybe there isn't quite this kind of totem pole for kind of progressive Britons to look at and get slightly dewy-eyed about anymore. The AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, has been on the rise. To what extent that is a hard left party or a far right party, a hard right party or a far right party is a matter of debate. But it certainly caused quite a lot of disquiet in Germany and also in Britain, certainly among people on the kind of progressive side of politics here. And also the third thing, I think, is the German economy has had a slowdown. Germany's been in recession, albeit from a pretty big head start. My view is that this is a cycle and it's going to come out of it. But nevertheless, I mean, I think it's a kind of reevaluation, really. I don't think things are quite as bad in Germany as the papers like to make out. But equally, I also don't think they're quite as good as they were before. So I think, it's a kind of wake-up call for people in Britain. Things were not... It's a big, complex country with 80-something million people living there, and a lot of industry, a lot of big cities, a lot of small towns, and it's got a lot of the same problems that Britain has. And I think, Britons are kind of coming around to that idea.
Yeah, because there was a moment, maybe especially during and before Brexit, where, people were thinking, there were articles and books written to the name of what does Germany get right, all of these kind of things. It's like, what can we learn from Germany, the real leader of Europe, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, why Germans do it better. I mean, that was a sort of convenient hook. And the books actually, John Compton books are actually kind of more kind of nuanced than that. But even so, I mean, it was a nice idea, wasn't it? I mean, it was partly because we were all stuck in lockdown and kind of watching the telly and obsessing about the news. And of course, Trump was going wild on Twitter. And there was this kind of logjam in the British system in the post-Brexit era, particularly with Theresa May. And then after the Theresa May logjam, you had the Boris Johnson roller coaster. And people who, at the time, who didn't want either to be in this gridlock with Theresa May or in this kind of rather chaotic and unpredictable setting with Johnson, and then looking across the pond and seeing Trump going on Twitter and saying all sorts of stuff, Merkel looked like the only grown-up in the room at times. And, some of that sheen has come off. Another big thing that has changed, of course, with regard to Merkel is that one of the few things that Trump got right, possibly a stop clock tells the right time twice a day, is that, he did sound off about Germany's dependence on fossil fuels, Russian fossil fuels in particular. And Germany's actually done a U-turn on that pretty quick. And it's quite remarkable how quickly they've changed tack. But you've got to say he was kind of right. And it was a necessary kind of change. I think the invasion of Ukraine did mean that Germany's had to rethink, and it doesn't look like it's kind of way out in front the way it did to people before.
Yeah.
Bit of a naive point of view, I think, but I mean, it was understandable. Like I say, if you're stuck in lockdown, glued to the telly, and all you've got to watch is 24-hour news, and you see Merkel shuffling around looking, businesslike, and you see Trump and Johnson and May all kind of doing their different things, it's a natural conclusion to come to. But I think some of the sheen has come off the Merkel legacy, certainly.
And I think it's always been more of a reflection of domestic politics here, what we think of foreign countries, right? I mean, it was almost less about Germany itself, our view of Germany, and more about what we reflected on domestic politics here, because it was more, oh, look how bad Brexit is, or look how bad Trump is, look how stable they are, with no actual interest in understanding Germany to the degree, for example, that you do. And you write in your piece, for example, the difference between Berlin and the countryside, the difference between different demographics in Germany, all of these things, not actually what people are interested in.
Well, absolutely.
They're just interested in Germany as a foil for the UK.
Yeah, and I think that, as you say, that applies to a lot of countries, America as well, for instance. It's tempting to kind of look for what we want to find in these countries. And certainly if you go to Germany, yes, you can go to Berlin or Cologne or Hamburg and meet a certain kind of demographic and come back with a completely different point of view than if you go to small towns or villages or the countryside or farmland in Bavaria or whatever. It's a very, very diverse place. And rather like America, I think America's a helpful analogy. I mean, it's a federal system, rather like America. Local politics, regional politics is possibly more important to a lot of Germans than national politics. Their state capital is their capital more than Berlin. They're kind of, you wouldn't say looking inwards, but they're often rooted in their own communities, and it's not like all Germans are Berliners by any means.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting that this Merkel legacy is being reevaluated now in the years since she has left office. I mean, Russia, you mentioned, is one way in which it's being reevaluated. I also think, I write about China, I look at China. When you look at Germany's China policy, that I think also has some level of reevaluation that will come in the future. You look at the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which is the Chinese EU financial deal pushed through by Merkel very much. But at the moment, it's dead in the water because the EU Parliament will not ratify it. And that's, again, another Merkel legacy. You say that the war in Ukraine has made Germans reevaluate Russia. The Chinese reevaluation, I think, hasn't quite come yet. And I think it's fascinating to me how Merkel's legacy could be changing even after she leaves office.
Absolutely. And I think we only saw one side of the coin. I mean, to be fair, going and covering 2017 election, for instance, and going back in 2021 for the Spectator and other people too. I mean, I never felt that the Germans were quite as rosy-eyed as certain people, starry-eyed as certain people here in Britain were. We tended to see the kind of foreign policy she was the right person at the right time in terms of foreign policy as it seemed then. I mean, obviously not now in the light of Ukraine, but at the time, we tended to just see the foreign policy rather than the domestic picture. It was a lot more mixed. I think the other thing to remember about Germany is, I mean, the system's very different there in that not just in the Bundestag and the German National Parliament, but all the way down, it's a whole network of coalitions. It's the constitution, which, partly is a legacy of Britain's role in recreating Germany after the Second World War, the Bundesrepublik, completely new country, essentially, is that it's almost impossible for one party to sort of drive through everything they want to do, or for one leader to. I mean, we tended to see Germany equals Merkel, but actually on the ground, it was much more of a sort of collective process. And usually a case of not just in the Bundestag, but also in the regional parliaments as well, different parties working together. And of course, the wild card now is the rise of Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, and the fact that this is a party uniquely almost in German politics, modern German politics, that the other parties won't work with. And that is the big question now, because they're polling something around 20% at the moment. And normally when a party gets to that level, that you'll find on regional level, even in national level, they're working with other parties. And there are some quite unusual alliances in German politics. For instance, the CDU, which is roughly speaking the Conservative Party in Germany, is working on, in national government with the Green Party, And also, historically, a lot of times they've done it not just on a national level, but on a regional level as well. And yet AfD is the one party that the other parties won't work with. And Friedrich Merz, the CDU leader, Merkel's successor in that regard, he then had to row back quite recently because he was saying, we're never going to work with these people on a national level, but, we have to maybe think about it if there's he just kind of floated the idea really, that of the possibility of working on a local level, and then had to row back on it very, very clearly. I mean, he never said he would, but he just kind of raised the idea, and then the reaction was quite strong. But if you are going to have a party which is polling 20% in a sort of, system of proportional representation and coalition governments on regional and national levels, then it's quite a big step to say that if this party's on 20%, we're not going to have anything to do with them. But that is the situation at the moment, and that is the big debate in Germany at the moment. Is should we ban these people? Should we think again? Whatever. I mean, and obviously it throws up a lot of difficult historical questions as well.
But your point to people who are concerned about the AfD, people who are concerned about the economic slowdown, is that Germany has never been that perfect, but at the same time, it can also overcome these current issues, which, frankly, all modern democracies face.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think what's happening is that the CDU, I mean, this is another thing, the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, Merkel's party, was always a kind of Heathite conservative party more than the Thatcherite party, but it was a conservative party nonetheless. And she really took it bit by bit, very gradually, for over 16 years in office, but she took it to the centre ground, away from the centre-right to the centre, almost made it a kind of soft left party in some respects. Now, this was politically very astute in terms of domestic politics, in that this really emasculated the SPD, which is the kind of social democratic soft left party in Germany, and kind of, stole a lot of their territory and left them with nowhere to go. But it did open up a space on the right, and this space has been filled by AfD. I think what's going to happen is the CDU is, and I think it's already starting to happen, is going to be moving back towards becoming a centre-right party again. And this will prevent there being a really big breakthrough by AfD. I think it will be more manageable, but it's still significant, it's still troubling, and it's still a cause for concern, certainly.
William, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
And finally, how important is food to your sense of national identity? I know that as a Chinese person, it's very much central to mine. According to a new book by the chef Anya von Bremzen, that's the case across many different cultures. And yet, it's not always clear that these national dishes really are so integral to a national identity. She joins me now. Anya von Bremzen, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
Thanks for having me.
So, Anya, what made you want to look into this question of food and national identity to start with?
Well, it all started a long time ago when I published my first cookbook called Please to the Table in 1990, and it's about the food of the former USSR. And as the book went to print, the USSR collapsed and separated into all these different countries. And by the way, I was born in Moscow, so it was home territory. So I kind of witnessed this nation building as it was happening in real time, coming back to these post-Soviet spaces and seeing new identities, new cuisines, new articulations, what it is to be a nation. And of course, these days, we have this paradoxical situation where on the one hand, nations and nationalism seem almost obsolete in this day of an age of absolute globalization. And at the same time, they've never been stronger. We have this compulsion to tie food to place, to search out for the roots of what we eat. So what better prism to examine this paradox than food? And I decided it would be, rather than just kind of talk generally, it would be nice to look at national dishes of certain countries, foods that we love, that we know, that have become extremely globalized, like ramen, pizza, tortillas in Mexico, these kind of things, and see how we can trace the rise of nations and nationalism through these dishes.
I mean, it sounds fascinating. I haven't read your book just yet, but I definitely want to. What made you choose the different countries? You went to 6 different countries. What made you choose them? Is it just how international the food was?
I think partly it was the dishes themselves. So I started in Paris, where the whole idea of a nation and national cuisine was forged, you could argue, with the French Revolution and with the French chefs in the 19th century articulating this idea that, food is a uniquely French cultural product and export. So I look at pot-au-feu, which is considered France's national dish, and it's a stew, a soup, vegetables all in one cauldron. That was really some call out and sacred in Paris. So I'm looking at what happened to that dish, and I'm finding that the French are just not interested anymore in the idea of their own cuisine, which is so funny. And then I look at pizza and pasta al pomodoro in Naples, which is so iconic and so important. But think about it, Italy didn't exist until the 1860s. There was no such thing. And pizza and pasta al pomodoro are uniquely Neapolitan and tied to the South. Tomato is where, Naples is where the tomato first made its appearance. So it goes like this. Then I go to Japan, which is fascinating to everyone and has its own fascinating nation-building process. Around the same time as Italy, 1860s, 1870s, Japan is a collection of disparate islands with like no national identity, no national cuisine. Then comes the Meiji Restoration, the kind of push to pull it together into one country. And again, what happens to the cuisine? And I'm looking at ramen, which is a fairly recent addition to the canon, and it's Chinese, in fact. So here we have one of those paradoxes. And I'm also looking at gohan, which is white rice, which is a hollowed cornerstone of washuku, which is a national cuisine of Japan. But is it real, that national cuisine? Is it a myth? So again, I'm looking. From there, I moved to Spain to look at tapas, which is not so much one dish, but a meal, a tradition that also just took off tremendously all over the world because we all are crazy for small plates. And I'm in Seville, in Andalusia, looking at how that region, that sultry south, represents all the cliches about Spain, flamenco, bullfighting, and how that came to be, and how food is part of it. From there, I go to Mexico, to Oaxaca, which is the most indigenous state in Mexico, and I'm looking at the corn tortilla and mole, which is this complicated, elaborate stew that represents the fusion-y aspect of Mexican identity, the fusion of European and indigenous influences, and I'm looking at how that identity is playing out. And then from there, I go to Istanbul, where I have a home, so it's a natural for me. And I'm looking at another small plates tradition, which is meze, which is very popular now. And I'm looking at Ottoman multiculturalism through that food tradition. So these are places I know well, that I've written about before, that made sense for me, but they're also sources of some of the most fascinating cuisines and traditions that we know. Of course, the book could have been endless. It could have been 20 dishes. People say, why didn't you do chicken tikka masala as a British national? I'm saying, well, it's been written about. There are other good books about it. So I went to places that I had a connection to, that I've written about previously, but looking at from a completely different angle.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think you can write this book about almost all countries in the world, probably all national identities. This question about you saying, are these real? That's a really interesting word, I think, that you used here, because I think what people often forget is how recent, how new nationalism itself as a force, the national identity itself is. And so often these dishes themselves don't have the kind of provenance. We often think about, I'm Chinese, we talk about our thousands of years of history, but I was actually shocked to find that the chili, this idea of Chinese food being spicy, the chili was only introduced to China in the 1500s and from South America. So what makes something an inherent part of a national identity? Is it always kind of constructed by the people who identify as that? I mean, how real is anything is, I guess, what I'm asking.
No, absolutely, you're right. I mean, there was no identification as a national. The category almost didn't exist until more or less the French Revolution or the late Enlightenment and the articulation of the idea of nation as we know it with a common language and common customs. And the idea of a national cuisine comes even later. So everything is constructed. And looking at so many myths, I was shocked to discover how many lies there are. For instance, the whole, Pizza Margherita, which is named after this famous Italian queen, who supposedly tasted it post-unification in Naples, even though she was from the north, and allowed it to be named after her. And it's repeated in all the scholarly books, but it's a total lie. It turns out to be, concocted by a certain pizzeria in Naples in the 1930s. Ramen, again, is a Chinese dish, and the inventor of the instant ramen, Momofuku Ando, is in fact from Taiwan. And he, in fact, didn't even invent it. There was another guy also from Taiwan who he bought the patent from. So once you look, everything is full of holes, all these myths, and it's really fascinating how it is. But in fact, what I argue, what is authentic? Authentic is what feels authentic to a particular group at the moment. So on the one hand, I'm very critical of nationalism. We're seeing so many ugly manifestations of it. On the other hand, I sort of have a grudging respect for the narrative, because the narrative is extremely powerful. And food is generally a powerful medium to convey anything. So once we impose those nationalist narratives and tropes onto food, it becomes almost explosive. And my last chapter, which I really wish I didn't have to write, is on borscht, the beet soup that Russians and Ukrainians claim as their own. And I was born in Moscow, eating borscht almost every day. My mom is from Odessa, Ukraine, but she lived all her life in Moscow. Then we emigrated. So I had a different epilogue in mind for the book, but then the war breaks out. And with it, that whole ugly argument about borscht, because Russians are suddenly goading Ukrainians, saying, well, it's our dish, and Ukrainians say, how is it possible? Because in fact, it's a Ukrainian dish. So my last chapter is a very personal and very tragic meditation on this difficult aspect of national identity and food. We have Ukraine being attacked by Russia. I felt like I had to renounce my past and my Russianness, because I wanted nothing to do with that country. I've been living in the States since I was 11. But that dish that signified home for me, I kind of had to just abandon it and said, look, it is Ukrainian. And if I'm going to cook it and think about it, I'm going to do it from a Ukrainian perspective. I'm going to learn Ukrainian, read about it in Ukrainian, talk about it to Ukrainians. It goes to show you how immediate and powerful food can be.
Yes, well, Anya, especially for diaspora like you and I who moved to a different country in childhood, that food is a real immediate connection. So I can't imagine the kind of conflict that you've been going through in the last year with your identity.
It's been very wrenching, yeah. But at the same time, borscht became a symbol of solidarity movement, a hashtag. The Ukrainians have been doing this incredible job of promoting it and raising awareness of their situation through food. Again, because food is so immediate. So this is what the book is about. So many issues, they're complicated, they're fascinating, and I'm using food to look at history, politics, social constructs, and just the idea of home and what it means to different people.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Anya, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV, and I hope viewers at home do pick up a copy of the book. I know I certainly will be. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us next week.